Okay, let me welcome everyone at the World Bank Jobs and Development Platform, discussion across country difference in skills. My name is Maciej Lis, and I'm going to moderate the discussion. I'm joining from the Institute of Structural Research in Warsaw, in Poland. It is a part of the World Bank series on important labor market issues and also development issues. And we are going to focus our discussion on the results of OECD skill surveys results, PISA and PIAAC, and the lessons that can be learned by the educational and labor market policies from these surveys. We're also going to discuss the skills in general, the skills role in the economic development. These PISA and OECD and PIAAC surveys are measures of the level of basic skills such as literacy and numeracy in an harmonized manner in all OECD countries. And the results of both these tools are consistent, showing some countries we have great successes in education and others showing failure in skill formation. So we're going to discuss what's behind these results and why researchers or policymakers should care about them. Here we have experts from all over the world, and we're going to share different perspectives on these issues, and how we will able to debate in the, also on the general picture of the role of skills in various levels for economies at various levels of economic development. First, let me start with introducing the outstanding experts on this topic from all around the world we have here. First, Aaron Binevo is the director of education at UNESCO in Paris. He's got a great international experience in educational research and policy making. Aaron, could you introduce your field of expertise and also some recent and made engagement of UNESCO in the field of education and skill formation? Could you unmute, Aaron? We can't hear you.
Okay, we'll do it once again. My field of expertise is the comparative study of education systems. I'm a sociologist by training. And I've written extensively about the impact of education on economic development, looking at learning assessments in recent years, not just at the international level, but also at the regional and national level. And currently I'm director of the Education for All Global Monitoring Report that also examines very carefully the results of both international, regional, and national learning assessments.
Yes, thank you very much, Aaron. Now let's turn to Maciej Kubowski, who is a professor at Warsaw University in Poland. He served as a deputy minister of Ministry of Education in Poland, and also he took part in some evaluation projects of educational policy. Could you say a few words about your recent research and your expertise, Maciej?
Thank you, Maciej, for introduction. So my expertise in the area is in the area of economics of education and general research of education policies, evaluating them, usually also using international data, international perspective. Recently, I also work in as a policy advisor, introducing assessment systems, and now I'm in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia when I work with the Public Education Evaluation Commission, introducing assessment system here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then we've got Ashish Mehta from University of California, Santa Barbara, who besides his research experience has also some policymaking experience which he gained in the Asian Development Bank. Ashish, could you say us something about your recent research in linking human capital and skills with the structural transformation of societies?
Okay. Yeah, so I do a lot of things looking at essentially the demand for skill and how it ties to the structure of employment, what kind of jobs are available, how those are changing, and then what that does to economic inequality, particularly. So I do that. And I've also been doing some work trying to understand the extent to which supplies of human capital act as constraints to development, industrial upgradation of qualitative and quantitative approaches.
Thank you, Ashish. And finally, we come to the next poll, who is working there as a research in socioeconomic policy group in Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He's been involved in many international projects on skills. Nick, what is your perspective on skills, and what's your experience in expertise in this area?
Yes, hi, thanks, Mashik. Our research focuses on trying to combine measures of educational access and educational quality using international assessments and household data. So one of the big problems in sub-Saharan Africa, which is where we work, is that you have incomplete access. You've got countries like Mozambique that only have 53% of kids that will complete grade 6. And you can't compare that country as easily with a country like South Africa, where you have 95% of children that will complete grade 6. So you have to take into account non-enrollment and dropout to try and understand the dynamics of access and quality, and if there is a trade-off, which often people think when there are these rapid expansions to access like we've seen in many sub-Saharan African countries. So our interest is really in using these international assessments in combination with household data to tell us more about skills across the continent. I think you're muted, Maciej.
Okay. Okay, so I'll start the discussion with the discussion of the measurement of skills themselves. There are two great surveys around in the OECD countries, PISA and PIAAC. The first is concentrated on the 15 years old, and the other one on the all working population. And there are also some other measurement of skills from other countries which are not in the OECD, which I would like to also ask you about. But first, starting from this, they basically measure the basic reading literacy and mathematical reasoning skills. And do you think is it enough? It's quite a narrow perspective on skills, and so what do you think about this measurement as a measurement of educational systems in general, or in measurement of skills in general? Do you think these measures are eligible? Maybe Aaron or Maciej could add something.
Well, I'm willing to begin. My view is that the skills that are being measured by PISA in particular, and most of the focus of my attention has been on the types of skills and knowledge and other kinds of learning outcomes from primary and secondary education. It's my view that the kinds of skills that are measured by PISA are fairly limited and do not provide a very broad and in-depth perspective about the diverse learning outcomes that children acquire, adolescents acquire, at the end of the compulsory school years. And I realize that there are attempts to begin to look at other cross-curricular skills and competences in the PISA repertoire or toolkit in the years to come. But I think that the focusing exclusively on the skills that are currently being measured by PISA provides only a limited picture of important learning outcomes that children acquire in and through schools. And I think the point that was made by the colleague in South Africa is an important one. Certainly if we move outside of the OECD region and we begin to think about countries that have more limited access rates, especially at this lower secondary level at the end of the compulsory school years, then the kind of depiction that PISA provides, which is a school-based assessment, tells us very little about the kinds of skills and learning that goes on among children who have either dropped out or have stopped out of school. And we know that there are other kinds of assessments based on household surveys that can be very informative, and that it provides a much broader sense of skills both among young people in school and also those who are out of school. Currently, it's estimated that among adolescents, there are about 60 million children worldwide who are out of school.
Okay, and Maciej, I know you are a great supporter of the OECD and of the PIAAC and the PISA surveys and the way they measure the skills. Could you defend these surveys?
So I will partly defend them and partly not. Obviously, I worked for PISA for 3 years, so I emotionally attached to this study. But also a lot of research which we're doing with PISA at the OECD and I was doing at the university is showing that these skills are really crucial for success on the labor market or later success when you go, for example, to higher education. So the power of predicting using PISA scores the probability of going into higher education, for example, it's incredible, and you can see that PISA is really capturing the skills which are crucial for further education, but also for labor markets, as we see that people who have higher skills measured by PISA or by PIAAC are also those who are more successful at work. However, I agree that PISA has limitations, and those are very important, and Aaron already mentioned some of them. But to me, the crucial limitation is that PISA is not measuring so-called soft skills or other skills which are now very important in labor markets. So, for example, the ability to work productively in teams. However, we should recognize that none of the existing measurement projects is able to measure such skills in a comparable way across countries. I would say even that most of these projects are not able to measure reliably these skills within countries. So PISA stops when it should stop. And I think also that sometimes we say that, and I think you said that in the introduction to this discussion, that PISA is capturing basic skills. They are basic in the sense that these are foundation skills. They are important. The ability to learn with understanding, to read with understanding, is crucial to learn other things. This is a skill which we call lifelong learning skill. So the skill which allows you to learn other things. However, when you look at these skills, they are not simple. So, for example, if you look at mathematics in PISA, it's really measuring very complex thinking, and students at the highest proficiency levels are those who have analytical skills, which are also very important nowadays. So, summing it up, I would say PISA is measuring what is possible. It's not measuring only simple things. But I also agree that when you talk about developing countries, you should use other measurement methods and also focus on people who are not in school. Thank you.
So maybe, Nick, do you have something to add from the perspective of African countries and developing world?
Yeah, so one of the problems with PISA, like these other assessments which I mentioned, is that they're measuring 15-year-olds, whereas many 15-year-olds aren't in school anymore. So where it's okay in Germany or in Poland, for example, to be measuring 15-year-olds at the school level, if you were to do this in many of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, you would really have to make it a household survey. There is a version of PISA which is being developed at the moment and rolled out in developing countries called PISA for Development, which tests, it's a much easier test, so it tests more basic skills than the sort of traditional PISA. And we're currently in discussions with the PISA people to try and say what is the best way of capturing a nationally representative sample of 15-year-olds and doing that in cost-effective ways. I think something else which is important to mention on this point is that the types of assessments that work in developing countries are often very different to the types of assessments that can work in OECD or in developed countries. So where in South Africa, for example, we take part in the TIM study by the IEA, this study is so beyond what most students in South Africa can do that many students are just performing at random. In other words, you have the assessment is too far ahead of the students that it's not telling you useful information about the students that you're measuring. And this is why many of the tests that we take part in Sub-Saharan Africa, like SACMEC, and in Francophone West Africa, it's called PISA, these measure much lower level skills of literally just translating, being able to decode text and read for meaning on a very basic level, not even the levels that we're talking about with PISA. So I do think that the types of tests that you want to admit countries, but I also think that these tests are useful. I think that some of the work by American economists and German economists, Hanuschek and Bussmann, have shown that even though there are limitations to these studies, they are very predictive also of things like economic growth and differences in innovative productivity between different countries.
You have some additional remarks to add, Ashish, on the perspective of demand of skills?
Not a tremendous amount. One of the difficulties when you study skill and labor demand is that basically PISA is measuring 15-year-olds. What we want kind of work is what happens to these people once they join the labor market. So the PIAAC and the STEP surveys that the World Bank is running now are in some ways more normative of that, echo all the things that have just been said. We've recently done some work taking Hanuschek and Bussmann's of international data, combining TIMSS and PISA, normalizing them to try and understand what helps countries move through product space, learn to produce new things, and we do seem to be getting a pretty strong signal out of these tests. So I would concur with that they are measuring something, although of course it's not ideal.
By discussing what they really measure and if it is, and I think agreeing that it's not enough to measure what they measure, but still there are some, these surveys are harmonized among countries. The results are quite reliable in what they measure. So I would like to ask you, what do you think, what are the most important lessons from them, coming from them, just comparing the differences among different countries, taking into account the cultural differences, economic differences, and family background differences, of family formation differences in all these countries, and taking into account that there are some countries that really show stable successes, some of them showing some failures in developing these basic skills. What do you think is the most important lessons that policymakers should learn from these skill surveys? Do any of us have any strong opinion on that?
Oh, once again, I'm willing to jump into the pond here first. For a whole series of different reasons, both in terms of research design and even methodology, I think that some of the policy implications that can be derived from the comparative assessments are limited. For example, PISA is not a school-based assessment, it's not a curriculum-based assessment, but a cross-curricular assessment. It doesn't collect information about the actual curriculum that students are exposed to, nor does it actually collect information from teachers. To the extent that we would want to provide policymakers with information about more or less effective policies with respect to the curriculum, the kinds of textbooks, the kinds of pedagogy, the kinds of teacher training that would be needed, one would want to have explicit information from the source and not from head teachers about principals or head teachers about teachers, in order to be able to derive much more concrete evidence that's could be used for policymaking. Secondly, I also think that policymakers could gain much more perspective by looking at within-country variation, differences both between different groups of students in different parts of the country, different regions, or more rural and urban areas. And clearly some of the biggest differences are between schools. much of this evidence is, in some sense, muted or less salient because the emphasis is looking at trying to develop a standardized, more harmonized cross-national or comparative assessment. So I personally think that we should pay attention to assessing students in terms of the skills and knowledge that they acquire from explicit interventions in schools, and that a much more policy relevant information can be derived from national level of assessments, which have, by the way, exploded internationally. This is information that is not as well known. In the next global monitoring report that we'll be publishing in April, we will show that the number of countries that are conducting national level assessments have basically doubled in the last 10 to 15 years. So there clearly is interest in conducting such national learning assessments that often provide more nuanced information, and in my opinion can provide much more policy relevant information, especially for ministers of education and not just ministers of finance.
So do you think that just if countries want to follow the leaders of the in PISA or PIAAC, like Finland or South Asia country like North Korea, do you think is it still a good way of thinking of education, just to trying to follow their ways, or it is just irrelevant and we should focus on more insight surveys or research that would bring us detailed results on the specific curricula and so on?
Once again, if I just kind of continue my line of thinking, certainly there are two, I think, key reasons why certain countries perform better than other countries. One has to do with whether or not there's an end-of-cycle high-stakes examination at the end of secondary level, at the end of secondary education. Certainly that drives a lot of the motivation in various parts of East Asia. The other point that is not very well picked up in PISA and some of the international assessments is the use of tutors and cram schools and all kinds of out-of-school, highly focused educational experiences that many of these children and their parents are paying huge amounts of money for. This is not the case in Finland, but it certainly is in the case of some of the other very high performers. So this is not, I think, given, this is often called shadow education. This is not given the kind of attention that I think it deserves. The one point that I would think that one can take away from, let's say, PISA has to do with the question of equity and more or less equitable systems. So clearly there's a relationship between the socioeconomic background of students and their performance, but the degree or the extent of this relationship really does vary from one country to another. And certainly Finland is a wonderful example of a country in which this relationship is fairly small or not very, I mean, it's much smaller than it is in many other countries, which shows the certain kinds of equity-oriented policies that are very strong in Finland. And certainly this is something that could be modeled in other countries.
Do you also, Maciej, do you also agree with the statement that the most important lessons from the PISA is that on the equity of school and equity policies, or is there anything that can be learned on the also curriculum or other sorts or efficiency of schooling systems?
So I think showing that the equity and that outcomes within countries are not equitable is one of the outcomes of PISA. It's an important outcome, of course, but PISA was also one of the first studies showing differences between countries in average performance. And this was a huge discovery in some countries, and the famous example here is Germany, which in Germany, basically PISA caused a revolution and it really changed the picture people had in mind about their education system in the country. And this was only possible thanks to a very reliable assessment of student skills, which is comparable across countries. So PISA is showing it's basically discovering quality or discovering lack of quality. It's discovering equity or lack of equity across countries, and it's basically may be used to analyze system level differences mostly, while there's also a lot of research analyzing results within countries. And it should be noted that for many countries participating in PISA or PERS or TEAMS, these are the only studies which are measuring educational achievement and are providing any data for analysis. So it also serves these purposes within countries. I agree with Aaron that sometimes the within country differences are even more striking than between country differences. We are focusing, when we present PISA data, people are focusing on league tables, comparing, looking at Shanghai or Finland, or recently Poland moving up to the top or being on the top. But if you look at within countries differences, they are much larger than differences between countries. So if you look at students with low socioeconomic background and compare them to students with high socioeconomic background of different areas or regions of the country, sometimes these differences are larger than between, for example, Finland and Poland or other countries. So, and PISA is also discovering that, as I said, this is sometimes the only study countries have to look into this kind of data, to look at student outcomes. I agree it would be great to have more details about curriculum or teaching methods, and the other study, not PISA, but PERS and TEAMS, are focusing much more on this. They have teacher questionnaires, they're collecting information about curriculum. They also, instead of focusing like PISA, for example, on socioeconomic background of students, they're collecting more information about teaching methods and learning methods. However, I have a problem with this. I basically, as a researcher, I don't think we can, using international data, go into such details like curriculum differences or teaching method differences. I think this data can be used for internal research within countries, and I think we need much more detailed studies, for example, of teaching methods to find what really works, rather than international studies. And when we talk about PISA and outcomes of this study, it's just to mention that it's really PISA who discovered Finland, a country which now everyone is trying to understand the education system, to learn from them. It really discovered, like I already said, that Germany is really struggling with the effect of socioeconomic background, of performance, or of immigrant students, and it caused also changes in policy in this country. In the case of Poland, PISA was actually the only study we had to evidence our success. So without PISA, we wouldn't know that our policies were successful. And this was really important recently when we used PISA to defend the reforms, to defend these policies in the Polish parliament, because many people have different views, not based on the data, and we use this data to defend what Poland did over last years. I agree also. Just a final thought about developing countries and also discovering the lack of skills among some people. So basically in developing countries, like Nick said, the level of students is so low that PISA is basically useless. And what we are discovering in these countries is that students who are finishing compulsory education or finishing primary education, they lack basic skills. For example, they should be able to read while they lack basic reading skills. This is also a kind of discovery. You need studies like PISA, but not only PISA, but also other studies. And the recent study will be talking about PIAAC results. PIAAC results, in a sense, discovered that 1/5 of Europeans is not really able to read and understand what they are reading and analyze texts. This is a very a simple message from this study, but it's really striking when you think about policies you try to implement at the European level. Thank you.
So I've just got some comments on the back of Machik's comments on some of the uses that we put these assessments to in developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in South Africa, middle-income country, is that these assessments, because they are done by international organizations and have a level of independence, they're able to measure relatively reliably, even if it is a subset of important skills and knowledge. They don't only measure across countries, but also across time. And that's been a really important thing for South Africa, is to be able to make claims about whether or not the improvements, inverted commas, improvements that we're seeing are legitimate, and what the Department of Basic Education is claiming as being improvements using their own assessments, which aren't comparable across time using, they don't use item response theory or RASH or any of the kind of psychometric techniques that are used by organizations with tests like PISA or TIMSS or PEARLS. So I think that brings a level of accountability to education systems that don't have the capacity to make those judgments and have the legitimacy to make those judgments by themselves. And that's been really important in the South African context, where there has recently been some improvement, but then the government also has to acknowledge that if these are the tests that they're using to say that there's been an improvement, they also have to acknowledge what else the tests are saying. So for example, in South Africa, we have more than a quarter, we have 27% of grade 6 children that are completely illiterate. So not they can't read for meaning, they are completely illiterate. And that isn't coming out through that's only coming out through the international assessments that are benchmarked with different levels that can say this is what children can do and when. So I think there's a strong feedback mechanism from these international assessments into our local assessments, and also the development of assessment capacity within our own provincial and national capacities. So with SACMEC, for example, which is the Sub-Saharan African regional testing system, there's an explicit focus on housing these testing systems within the departments of basic education to raise their competencies in being able to run assessments. The one other thing which is perhaps uncommon for the other assessments apart from SACMEC, which is done in sub-Saharan Africa, is that SACMEC doesn't only test students, it actually also tests their teachers. So these are primary school teachers, maths and language teachers, and now we have relatively reliable data on the content knowledge of maths and language teachers. And work that I've been involved in now analyzing that data with maths experts and language experts has been really influential in pressurizing the government to acknowledge that we do have this crisis in math. The maths teachers know and can do. And in many instances, they cannot pass the tests which we're asking their students to pass. And that this is obviously a huge problem. So I think that's really important for advocacy purposes, not just a reliable indication of what the students are doing, but also using that information within the political process to try and improve the quality of education. That's been really important in the South African context.
Ashish, would you like to?
Yeah, if I might add, to echo what Nick was saying, in the Asian context, we see a similar function in terms of advocacy that these tests can play. So India participated in the PISA tests and dropped out, performed badly. It was embarrassing. Over the years, I think what we've come to learn, have very different amounts of resources to throw at education, actually sometimes performing at level with each other. So one of the things that commitment to fixing education quality is a crucial input. And to the extent that these tests allow advocates for improved education quality to push hard, extremely valuable function, and that's something we should not forget.
If I may
sorry, Aaron, just a five-second insert here. That's exactly what we found in South Africa, where we're spending 5 times as much per pupil than in Kenya, and yet, according to the SACMEC results, we have the Kenyan students are outperforming the South African students. And again, this was sort of big news in South Africa, that we spend so much on education, but find it so difficult to produce similar outcomes. But sorry, Aaron, back to you.
No, I just wanted to say something about the Indian context. I just came back from New Delhi a couple days ago, and among other things, I spent the occasion at the launch of what's known as the Pratham-ASA report. This is the annual status of education report. This is a citizen-led assessment. This was the 10th report that the Pratham group have published in India. They do not follow IRT, the item response theory. They use a very simple instrument. But the very interesting thing is that they go into literally tens of thousands of households throughout India in small villages, helping to mobilize parents and also local community leaders about the importance of education, about the importance of parents continuing to send their children to education, and to demand changes by state and provincial authorities in ways that are not seen by the kinds of assessment. I mean, only in the last couple of years has the Indian government undertaken the National Achievement Survey using much more sophisticated methods. But if we talk about who feels ownership over such assessments, and to the extent to which they mobilize community support and not just political support in government and various other kinds of statements about policies and various reforms that need to be undertaken. But if we think about the importance of mobilizing support for change at local community levels, then these citizen-led assessments can be enormously important. The Indian model has been used in Pakistan, is also being used now in East Africa and West Africa. It has different names, and in fact is piloted now in Nigeria and soon in Mexico. So this is a movement of doing assessments of basic learning, basic skills of young people in their homes, that you're able to capture skills, both those who are attending school and those who are out of school. But it also is part of a political empowerment process of getting local communities to feel a lot of ownership in their schools and improving the quality of the education that's being provided their children.
Yeah. So just on the back of that, Aaron, I do think that they serve different functions, though. So in East Africa, we've got these similar assessments to Pratham and ASA called Uwezo and Twaweza. In Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya, where same story. You go to they do these assessments in the households, an extremely simple assessment, and those assessment results go back to parents, and they use this to try and mobilize and lobby government for improvements, or lobby their own schools in many instances for improvements. One of the research things that we're looking into is to try and say, how well do those results correlate to the results of, for example, something like SACMEC? And what you find is that Uwezo and Twaweza, this is very preliminary research, but Uwezo and Twaweza are showing quite a different picture to what SACMEC is telling us about education in Kenya, for example. And now this is very interesting that they're both different assessments doing different things. Uwezo is much simpler than SACMEC. But how is it possible that they're telling us different things where Kenya is performing very well on SACMEC, but on similar kinds of items they're performing extremely poorly on Uwezo's data? And it's not based just on out-of-school children. So even if we assume that all of the children that don't reach grade 6 have the lowest level, it still doesn't tell us, equate the two pictures completely. I do also think, though, that one of the benefits, Aaron, you mentioned that these aren't curriculum aligned, many of these assessments. But in the South African context, by analyzing the items and getting maths experts to look at the results of the maths items, we've realized, or confirming previous studies, but this was on that South African students, and in the same instances South African teachers, have big problems with proportional reasoning, fractions, and the types of problems, mathematical problems, that are associated with those skills. Now, obviously, those aren't the kinds of things that you can get from an Uwezo type assessment, granted, because that's not the purpose of those assessments. So I do think that they perform complementary roles, but that we need both kinds of assessments, given that they actually aren't doing the same thing.
As we have gathered here some experience from India and Africa, I think mostly, maybe I know that some of you have also experience of educational system in Latin America, which most of countries from where are not able to gain some successes in in these surveys, or these surveys show that there are some important issues in Latin America as their educational system are concerned. Could you elaborate a little bit on their issues? Maybe I know that Aaron and Ashish, you have some experience of these countries.
Well, to the extent that I have some, I've never worked extensively in Latin America, so I'd like to just make that a qualification for the statements that I could make here. Number one, the enrollment ratios in most countries in Latin America, mainly South America, this is not necessarily as much the case in Central America. The enrollment ratios of these countries are relatively high. Most children are finishing primary education and are finishing lower secondary education. The Latin American countries typically talk about a basic education cycle of 3 different phases. Many Latin American countries also require students to take 1 year of pre-primary education. This is a region where there's the greatest prevalence of compelling parents to send their children to some kind of pre-primary framework, which is also a very important topic in many other parts of the world. So the issue about quality has been an issue that many Latin American ministers of education have been concerned about for certainly the last decade, if not longer, partly because issues of access have been less prevalent or less pressing, and so they've been very much concerned about the kind of education that's being provided, the quality of education, the quality of teacher training, and the kind of teaching that goes on. And certainly they're also, one of the biggest issues in Latin America are the levels of inequalities between poor and rich kids, and in particular between sparsely populated areas and more urban areas. Latin America has one of the more urbanized regions in the world, but the levels of inequality between poor and rich kids in certain parts of within country inequalities are enormous. There have been various interventions that have found to be rather successful, what are known as conditional cash transfers, programs in Brazil and other parts of Latin America that have paid the parents who reside in poor households to send their children to school to ensure that they are in school and not dropping out. This has been a series of programs that have certainly shown an important effect, at least in terms of the retention and the survival of children in school. It has been shown less effective in terms of improving learning outcomes. So this is one area where I think Latin America has shown a model that can be examined in other parts of the developing world or the global south. Another area that many Latin American countries have taken the lead on is providing various kinds of computers and notebooks and laptops to secondary level students on a fairly wide scale. In Argentina and Uruguay and Chile and several other parts of certainly the Southern Cone countries, we see various kinds of programs that have attempted to use various kinds of public-private partnerships to, with the government to provide laptops or notebooks to many children who come from less advantaged backgrounds or who attend relatively poor schools. These have shown mixed impact. One of the problems being the extent to which there's teacher development or professional development that accompanies. It's easy to give computers, relatively easy, that are bundled software, but it's much more difficult to provide teachers with the kinds of skills of how to make use of these laptops in classrooms. And the final thing I would say about Latin America is that teacher unions are very strong in Latin America. They are an enormously potent political force, and many, let's say, the policymakers and many government officials have a certain ambivalence about, how should we say, bringing into the loop or involving teacher unions and teachers in the process of policymaking, in the process of developing educational reforms, and the marginalization of teachers in these particular contexts in Latin America, I think has not worked well. Teachers are often marginalized in education reform efforts, not just in Latin America, but in other parts of the world and also in OECD countries. And I think many lessons can be learned about how to mobilize teachers and their support in really bringing about effective reform implementation after you've, let's say, identified what some of the pressing problems are.
Thank you, Aaron, for this in-depth insight from the Latin America. Ashish, do you have anything to add?
So, yeah, I should say that I'm actually not a Latin American expert. I've done a couple of papers looking at some issues in Mexico. Most of my work has been in East, Southeast, and South Asia. One theme that keeps reemerging and ties into the Latin American work is that in improving skills comes when there's strong pressure from the demand side. So if East Asia, when countries like Thailand start to really push hard to get more people through school and to try and improve quality, it comes about because the country runs into serious productivity problems reflected in wages, wage increments to people getting a decent education start to go. That's when you start to see the political pressure built to actually overcome some of these significant political barriers that Aaron just mentioned. Governments can actually do things about this. So in Mexico, for example, conditional cash transfers increase the demand for medical care. And one of the things that we were able to link in some of our work was the fact that increased demand for medical care now encourage more women to attend medical school, and there's been a dramatic increase in female college attendance, a significant portion of which is driven by this potentially by this increased demand for doctors. So the demand side is important, and there's a number of ways in which this starts to show up in the data. Conversely, you have countries like the Philippines where labor migrates. There tends not to be a very strong demand for skill within the country, and the education system tends to get distorted towards creating easily marketable skills abroad rather than developing foundational skills that would actually serve the economy at home. So try to stick that in there, the demand side.
There's quite an interesting connection here between the Latin American case and that in sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly South Africa. Given the income inequality that we have in South Africa, we often look to Latin American countries to try and learn from some of their experiences. We also have very strong in South Africa. But one of the findings that we have in sub-Saharan Africa, which Aaron mentioned when talking about Latin America, is that many of the inequalities that we see between different subgroups get exacerbated when you take into account access differentials and not just quality differentials. So if you're just looking at SUCMEC and you're saying, what are the reading scores or the math score differentials between boys and girls, for example, that doesn't take into account that in many countries, many girls are not reaching the grade 6 level where you're testing them. In the case of Lesotho, it's the exact opposite. You have boys that, because of a cultural tradition of herding, you have twice as many girls that are reaching grade 6 and can read versus boys, and this is mainly due to dropouts of boys in Lesotho, which is contrary to the trend on the continent. But to give you an idea of the difference between boys and girls, if we measure the number of students that reach grade 6 and are literate, so they can read for meaning, for boys, this is in Mozambique now, you have 50% of a cohort of boys, whereas for girls you would only have 35%. So that's the 15. But if instead we look at the poorest 40% of students and we compare them to the wealthiest 20% of students, you've only got 17% of the poorest 40% of students that actually reach grade 6 and can read, in comparison to 77% of the wealthiest 20%. So you have a 60 percentage point differential between poor and rich, whereas a 15 percentage point differential between boys and girls. So I think this is also something that was not necessarily surprising, but very interesting, that came from our study, that the differentials between wealth differentials between rich and poor were considerably larger in every single one of the 14 countries that we looked at than were the gender differentials between boys and girls. We do find that poor girls face a double disadvantage. so disadvantaged based on their gender and based on the fact that they're part of a marginalized socioeconomic group, being poor. But by and large, the differences between rich and poor are considerably greater than those between boys and girls. And I think this is something which also needs to feed into the global discourse when we're talking about the post-2015 Millennium Development Goals and what needs to be done going forward in measurement. Is also measuring these for rich and poor, not just boys and girls.
And I think it's also one of the most general lessons from all these skill surveys that that educational or curricula or any part of education, any investment in education, is just a lesser part of the in terms of skill achievement or all achievement of students, as the family background and cultural differences matter so much, and the home investment are so important in that area. But maybe I will come back to Maciej to ask him about an example of Poland in terms of changing curriculum and changing educational, and how this changing in educational system affected the results of PISA exam in time. Could just give some example of how the changes in educational system can be assessed with these surveys, with more details on the changes in Poland in the recent years.
So when we talk about Poland, PISA provides evidence about two reforms we implemented over time. The first PISA study came just before the implementation of the large structural reform, when we extended comprehensive education. And we did evaluation for the World Bank. There is a paper showing that students with the lowest socioeconomic backgrounds, and students who would previously end up in the vocational track, were those who benefited mostly from this reform. And this is an obvious result, but it's also good to have a strong evidence on this kind of outcome of the reform. Also, this evidence is showing that students who are at the top of performance distribution, they were not harmed by this reform, and over time they also benefited from other elements of the reform, because the reform was much more complex. Then we had in 2008, 2009 curriculum reform, when we modernized the curriculum. We rewrote it in the language of learning outcomes. We focused more on problem solving, analytical skills, rather than acquiring knowledge. We also introduced a new system of school evaluation, which is also focusing on quality. And we see that improvement in the PISA scores. I'm afraid I will be disconnected soon, but I will try to finish. So we see the improvement, and what is really striking is that the last reforms, the last changes show that these reforms benefited all students. They benefited girls and boys. They benefited students with coming from poor, uneducated families, and those who are coming from well-educated families. And we are talking about Chile also, and I remember Chile was also striking. The results were striking in 2009, showing that they also improved a lot, but also improved across whole spectrum distribution of performance, and equally among boys and girls. So these are kinds of reforms which are affecting all students, and obviously there is no causal analysis behind it, because having cross-sectional data like PISA, it's pretty difficult. Even if you look at relatively short time series, it's difficult to find do any causal analysis. But I think there's a very plausible interpretation in some cases, which policy changes draw.
I think we can't hear Maciej anymore. Maybe we'll join in a minute. We'll manage to do it. But maybe after discussing all the cross-country experience, I'll just ask you, what do you think when looking in the more general picture in changing labor market, in globalization taking place with the ICT technology revolution and changing the way we work and how the labor demand changes. I would just ask you, how does it affect how should it affect the general skill formation and educational policy in these countries? Should the same skills be learned, or should these skills be learned differently, or how? So what do you think are the biggest challenges for the educational systems in general and specific regions for now? Should we start with Aaron once again, or?
I thought our Indian colleague would jump in on this question here.
Okay.
I would, yeah. I'm happy to listen to.
I think we can't hear you, Aaron.
Yes.
All right. Sorry about that. bit of confusion with the microphones. Sorry, Aaron, to interrupt you. Okay, so this is something I've been doing a lot of work on, is trying to understand the effect of globalization on skill demand. And I think the one starting point is to actually consider just how globalized labor markets are or are not getting. Okay? And while it's pretty clear that we've got growing shares of world output that are traded, what I'm finding in my research, trying to compile data on how many workers produce something that's tradable for a living, that number actually may be going down, or depending on how you define it, is probably stagnating, particularly in the developed, right? And this has to do with people moving out of agriculture. So that's one traded sector that's shrinking. Manufacturing employment around the world is not going up as a share of employment. Services are becoming tradable, but these are very high-end services for the bulk of the population. They're basically selling things to each other, services to each other, and competing for jobs with each other. So when we start to think and whether it needs to serve international competitiveness motives, I think there's a need to be a little in our judgments on that. And I think what that means is that all the discussion that we've had about inequality of educational outcomes within countries is what really comes to the fore. The question is, what do education systems do to try and overcome social stratification? Are they capable of taking people from poor socioeconomic backgrounds and moving them up the economic ladder? And I think this is where the value of things like PIAAC and PISA start to come in. And again, the demand side, because again, what you see is there's vast differences across countries in the demand for skill, right? You see this in migration patterns. There are countries that educate large numbers of people who then leave, other countries who attract them, right? Again, that's about differences in demand. I could go on about this, but let me just basically put it as we have to think about the demand side of the equation in order to solve these issues, and that goes back to thinking about what are the other constraints on skilled job creation.
Okay, now we can come back to Aaron, I think, with no problems.
Yes. Well, I certainly want to echo many of the comments that Ashish has made here. I think it's enormously important to look at the demand side. And it's also important to see the extent to which educational systems can reduce the kind of stratifying effects. So education is both a kind of an escalator, but it also can reinforce inequalities. And really the question is how much of these two channels are being emphasized in a particular national education system. But if we hypothesize for a moment and visualize a system that is relatively equal, the question really then, another question then arises, which has to do with the demand from the labor market, is really whose responsibility is it? Which social institution should take the responsibility for the training of skills of young workers who enter the labor market? Should this really be the role of the education system, even at the upper secondary level. We have much evidence to show that the kind of technical vocational education training systems are relatively expensive. They provide only a minimal advantage to those that are in other non-TVET tracks. So one wonders whether or not TVET is really the answer or to the kind of issues about the demands that are coming out of the labor market. And I think one of the most important things that comes out of the PIAAC study is the fact that you see that there are big differences between, first of all, those adults who are in the market, I mean, who are employed and those who are not employed. So being in a job in and of itself is important for not just it's important for the retention of skills that may have been acquired through formal schooling. But often the other part of it is that we don't have really good measures of on-the-job training, non-formal and informal learning experiences. Some are more structured than others, some in the workplace, some outside of the workplace. And in many ways, I think that PIAAC provides a platform for us to begin to go beyond what may or may not have occurred in the formal education system during the first 5 grades or 10 grades or however many grades a young person may have been in school, and we begin to ask if we're really taking seriously, and many of the post-2015 education targets are talking more and more about lifelong learning. So if we begin to design a system from birth to death, through the formal school system, through various kinds of non-formal educational frameworks outside of the formal school system, that may be as important, if not more so, for adults, for young adults, for adults in the middle parts of the year, especially because there's so many people who are transitioning from one job to another. The proportion of the population that stays in the same job over the course of their careers is going down. And so people are moving across different careers, across different kinds of jobs. So then all these post-formal education training frameworks become much more important. And I think we have much less systematic evidence about what particular kinds of non-formal or on-the-job training programs are more or less effective. What kinds of facilitators or teachers or educators, however you want to refer to them, are more or less effective in enabling adults to acquire skills that are relevant for the kinds of things that they perform in the labor market, especially if we focus on that particular part of it. Obviously, there's other kinds of skills that are important in terms of being a good citizen, in being a good parent, in being politically active, and all kinds of other different things. But for the narrow equation of looking at this fit or with meeting the demands of different kinds of skills in the labor market, I think these extra formal schooling or post-formal schooling frameworks, we need a lot more kind of systematic evidence about their impact, their influence, how to characterize them than we have right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Aaron. It seems that you have just managed to make a great sum up of the discussion and it's a great remark and time for closing it. I would just like to thank all the participants and all the viewers from taking part and bringing their contribution. So thank you very much once again, and hope to meet at another World Bank event. Thank you very much.